Hold on. Can you see? Yes, I can see. December 13th,
Is it recording?
2003. It's recording.
Okay.
Do you want to just let it run for a minute?
Are you ready to start?
Sure.
Okay.
It's December 13th, 2003. I'm here with Toby Thorsen. He's from Norway. He was there when it was invaded by the Nazis in 1940. So we're going to start with you telling us a little bit about where you were born and how you grew up, what your high school was like.
All right. Well, I was born in a small city. You don't call it a town, but it was a little city. And it was before cars came. So the houses were very close, and the streets, when they started driving, they had to make all the streets one way because there wasn't room for two cars to pass. But it was right on the fjord. So we had ships going up and down, the coast passenger ships, because that was an easy way to travel. There were also buses, but when you get inland, there were some farms. But I think that I remember that Norway there was 3% land that was farmland, and the rest was all mountains and wildness. But as I said before, that my father was a captain on a ship, and he actually left school when he was 14, because in those days you had to stay in school until you were 14 years old. So he went out on the actually sailing ship, because that's the way that ships were. And he was a deck's boy, and he was 14 years old. But eventually he went back and got sort of an education, and he then became a mate, because the ships they had people working in the engine room and stuff, and like my boy was a deck's boy, and my father was a deck's boy, and he studied, and he got to be a mate on a ship. And then that ship ran aground near Copenhagen, and the owner and the captain on the ship, that's the way it always went. They got mad at each other because the owner was mad at the captain because he had let the ship run aground, and the captain said it wasn't his fault, So the captain left the ship, and the ship owner said to my father, you take care of the ship, you're the captain. And he said, for the time being. And he was 26 years old. But he never changed, so he became the captain. And during there were the Spanish Civil War, was it? He was bombed by some airplanes in the Mediterranean, but they didn't hit him, his ship. And then when he went to a Spanish harbor, Spanish submarine hit him, but collided with him, But he managed to get out of that trouble too. But then during World War II, he was going from Scotland to Norway, and the Germans, during World War I, his ship was spotted by a German submarine, and they tried to sink it. They were shooting at it, but the sea was very rough, so they never hit. So finally, an officer from the submarine with some German soldier came aboard the my father's ship. And that officer said, do you mind if we take your food? And my father said, do you mind if we go in a lifeboat? Boats, there were two of the boats. So he said no. And my father and his crew went in those two lifeboats, and the Germans sank the ship. And it took him 2 days to sail, because in those days these lifeboats would use sails, they had no motor. And they made it to the Norwegian coast. And my father said he was sitting there steering the lifeboat with a compass to make sure he was in the right direction. And the other lifeboats lost, it tipped over. And all the people on that lifeboat, they all fell in the water, and they had to righten up the lifeboat again, and then get on board and empty all the water, and then continue. But of those people, one man drowned. And then, as I said, when World War II started, my father was actually with his ship while he was down in the Caribbean. And I guess he was going up to Newfoundland. And his ship was torpedoed by a German submarine. And I think there were like 20 people, 20 men, crew on board. And 6 of them in one lifeboat were finally, after a week or two, were picked up by a fishing boat. But the rest all went down. My father went down. But anyway, I was going to school in Thorbjorn because we had moved from one city to another. And the reason was actually that the man, the owner of the factory that built the ships that my father was with, he had his factory in Thorbjorn. So we moved up there because my father would come back to that city once in a while. And I went to school, I guess, for 10 years, because I started in the 3rd grade, and grammar school finished at 7th grade, then there was 3 years in middle school, and I don't know whether the high school was 2 years or 3, but anyway, I was a junior when the war started. And then after a month or 2, I went back to school. And it took me probably 2 years to finish high school. And then I knew a man who had been a policeman before the war, but the Germans were telling the police, what they wanted them to do. And he didn't like being have anything to do with the Germans. So he got a job in the personnel department and that was in that city where then that was a very big, probably the biggest factory in Norway. And he got a job there as in the personnel department. So he said to me, when you finish in school, let me know, and I'll get you a job. So when I did finish school, I told him, and he actually said, yes, but we have no openings in the office, so I'll get you a job in the chemical department, because the company was making fertilizers. And they always had to check, you know, to make sure the fertilizer was right. So I spent 3 months in the chemical department. Then I was transferred to the office. And I got one job there, and then after a little while I was moved to another office, and then after a while I was transferred to still another one. And when I was there, I was actually in payroll. That was the payroll department where I worked. And the Germans had built a factory next to this Norwegian company that they were going to, I guess, a light metal plant. That's all I know, but I think it was meant to be used for atomic bombs or whatever. So the Allied decided they were going to bomb that German plant, because that German plant was just about getting ready to start, you know, working. So we were right next to it. So when they bombed it, they had 120 planes, dropped 1,500 bombs. And of course they got that German plane, but they bombed our plant too because we were so close together. And at first, when we heard the air raid signal, we thought, oh, they can't mean anything. The Allied has so many places to bomb in Germany, they'll never come here. But they did. And a German officer came by, and we were just sitting outside on some steps and just sort of relaxing because we didn't think anything would happen. But anyway, that German officer forced us to go into because we did have places where you could go for shelter, I guess. But I worked in the payroll department, so we went in the cellar. It was a small cellar where they had all the payroll papers, you know. So this friend of mine and I, we sat down up against the cement wall because this was in the cellar. And when the first wave, there were 4 waves of planes, you know. And the first wave came, and you heard the noise from the airplanes. Then you heard the German anti-aircraft guns start shooting at them. And then you heard the bombs dropping sort of far away. And you could hear them sort of walk towards you because they got louder and louder until they exploded all around you. And the bomb fell outside the wall and actually made a half circle. And before that happened, my friend and I were sitting on a shelf right up against the wall. But I moved over a little bit, and I think I got tired of sitting, so I must have been lying down. And of course they had these storage, you know, shelves. And so I think that I ended up being in the first row between 2 shelves. And the bomb hit right outside the wall, and the wall cracked all over, but it stood up. But from my side up, the floor was knocked up, so it was like that. So my friend who was sitting over there, he was killed. And all the stuff in the building came crashing down when the bomb exploded. But it just made a little tunnel just where I was lying. It was like a little tunnel. And I remember when everything stopped, you know, I sort of went like this. And I said to myself, wow, I made it. So I crawled out and I went over to where the stairs were to go upstairs. And when I come outside, I heard somebody crying for help. So I walked where I heard the crying, so I saw this fellow sitting on the outside of the cellar wall. And he was buried up to his breast with gravel and things, and he was lying, actually leaning into the crater. And he had a lot of pieces of wood and stuff on top of him. So I ran over to him to get the stuff and start trying to get him, you know, dug out. Then I heard a voice down in the gravel. Oh, you're stepping on me. Then when I looked down the crater, I saw 2 feet sticking out. So I actually said, I'm sorry, but I've got to get rid of all the junk that's on top of this fellow. But anyway, I dug them both out. But before I finished, the second wave of planes came by. And the same thing, you would hear the explosions coming, walking at you, and then finally the bombs were exploding all around you. There were all the factory buildings, you know, and you could hear the echoes when the bombs exploded inside the buildings. And they exploded. I could hear it when they hit telephone poles, or I could hear the cracking of the telephone poles. All around me there were, it sounded, if you ever have been under a railroad bridge, when a train comes on top of it, it's a big noise. And that's the way it was. Because there were so many bombs that you really didn't hear each one. You just hear a big rumble. And actually 2 big rocks, one after the other, came flying right at me. And that must have been, I must have heard the noise. So I must have been looking in the right direction so I could throw myself over. Not getting hit. Anyway, I ran into ditch because there was too much trouble in the crater. And then a bomb fell right in front of me and threw up a lot of junk. And it, as you know, because of gravity, it slowed as it got way, way up, and it sort of stood for a little while and shivered, and then it all came right at me. But there was a tree not far away from me, so I ran over to the tree and stood up against the tree. And a lot of stuff hit the tree, but nothing hit me. And these are pictures, you know. They have one picture here.
So you got pretty lucky then.
Yeah. But
Do that.
I was lucky many times.
Who took these pictures?
Well, the Germans would not have allowed people to take them, but one man, he sort of sneaked around, took the pictures, and then he, you know, he may even have sold them, I don't remember. But he would have been in trouble with the Germans if they had known he did.
And on April 9th, 1940,
All right.
what was going through your head?
Well, as I said, I got up in the morning. I was got ready to go to school, but I had actually 4 older sisters, and one of them came and said, "You better listen to the radio." And the radio was saying that the Germans had landed at quite a few places along the coast, and that they had come in freighters. The people thought they were bringing merchandise, but instead they came with soldiers and just unloading them. And then they started, you know, trying to take over the country. And when I figured, well, I better go to school. I didn't know that the principal said the school will be closed for the time being. So that's when I heard the police needed help, and I went to the police, and I asked them if they needed help, and they said, "Yes, we can use you." And they put an armband saying "police" on the arm, and they said, "You go down to Main Street," and that was a shopping district. And he said, "Whenever you hear the air raid signal come on, you stop all traffic and tell everybody to go indoors." And there were no German planes bombing anything at that point, but there must have been observation planes, because they were coming and going all the time. I was out there all day, stopping traffic, telling people to go indoors. And they all obeyed me. I had no trouble at all. So the next day, I came back and I started my police job at 9 o'clock. And, you know, the same thing happened. Air raid signals coming and going. But at noon, the captain and the Norwegian army, and that wasn't because they were worrying about the Germans or anybody, but the system had been that the coast was divided in sections, and each section had a group of soldiers, and the captain was in charge of every section. So this captain in charge of our section, although we were a little bit away from the coast, you know, he came by with his chauffeur, and he stopped and he said, "Would you please join the army?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I have an opening in my lines, and I'm sending out a patrol tonight, and I want you to go with him." And I said, I'm finishing my police job here at 3 o'clock. I will go back to the police department, tell them I'm quitting the police because I'm joining the army, and I'm sure they won't mind. And he said, "Well, we'll pick you up at 5 o'clock." And then they took me out to the coast. And could you stop for a second?
We took a little coffee break. This is Nancy and Toby. We're getting a picture for the website.
Good stuff.
Are you gonna be able to see okay on that? I wish I had like the window thing. I just brought Brian's, he has one of his.
Alright.
Are you taping?
Yes.
So we were talking about the day after your country got invaded and you had just joined the army.
Yes, and we came out sort of at 5 o'clock, so we were out by the coast. I suppose maybe 6, 7 o'clock. And when you go on guard duty, you spend 2 hours as a guard. Then you have 4 hours to rest and sleep or whatever. Then you have go 2 hours again, and then 4. So that I was up sort of even before the sun. I think I was probably the one who went up. There were 2 of us each. And then I went down after 2 hours, and I was resting, and then I was up again 2 hours, and then it was like in the middle of the night. And that's when I was up and watching the activities, because there was a battle up in front of me, but maybe a little bit on the left. And I could stand up there and I could watch cannon fire, and you would see the cannon shoot, and then you would see the bullets hit the ground, and after a while there were fires burning, and then of course I could see machine guns, and a machine gun, every 5th bullet has some kind of chemical in it that burns, so that you can see where you're shooting. And I could see these fans, the machine guns going back and forth. And then what they did, they would shoot up well, they shot up flares. They also shot up blue markers, red markers, and I assumed that had certain meaning. They shot up a blue one, that meant something, and so on. But every so often they would shoot up the flares, and they would be like little parachutes. So they would drop down very slowly, and they would be so bright that where I stood on top of a hill, I was in daylight. It was completely, it was sort of like having the sun shine at you. But then that eventually slowed down, and my guard duty was over, so I went down to go to sleep. That is, I didn't take my clothes off or anything, but I did lie down. And then the sergeant came and said he had heard a lot of strange noises outside, and he wanted me to check it out. And, you know, I said, okay. So I went out, and I can still remember him standing there in the doorway, and he had a pistol. And it worried me a little bit that if he thinks the Germans are there, he may mistake them. He may mistake me for a German. Then he might start shooting at me. But anyway, I searched the area all over, and there was nobody, nothing there. And as I said, I didn't even find any Germans. But then the next day, we got a telephone call, and it said that, they said that you really don't have to stay out there anymore, because the Germans are, either they have bypassed you on the side, or they will do it any time. and there's no use for you people to stand there. So we'll pick you up. But when they came, they had a car, and everybody else piled into that car, and they had told me to bring a bicycle when they brought me out. Maybe they wanted me to bike around and be like a messenger, you know. So I didn't want to give up my bicycle, so I rode my bicycle home. And it was quite a long trip. But when I came close to where my house was, where I lived, I could hear these trucks coming at full speed behind me, and they were full of Germans. But I was able to turn into my street, and I sort of hid behind some bushes, and the Germans went by. And what they did, there was a radio station, not, you know, in Norway they had one radio station in Oslo, but every place around they would have these towers so that you could hear what was on the radio. And the Germans, they drove up to that place that was up on a hill, and they put explosives and knocked those towers down. And that may have been the next day, because I thought I would go back to the police station and see whatever they needed. But when I got, and the police station was part of the town hall, and when I came in there in the middle of town hall, a bunch of Germans came rushing in. So I figured, no, I don't want to get involved with the police. So I just walked away. But this is one thing that you must remember, that we had no chance of beating the Germans in any way. So that we gave up, you might say, the physical resistance. We were, and you sort of lived two lives because you had to make a living. So people would work, and everything would be like it was. You know, if you worked in a store, you would continue working in a store. If you, whatever you did, you would just, the Germans would be there, but you couldn't help it, so what could you do? But what we did was we just didn't want to have anything to do with the Germans, and we didn't want to have anything to do with the Quislings, as we call it, because Quisling was the name of the leader of the Nazi party. And we ignored them. Like with the Germans, if a German, you know, they might go to the movies if they had, but if there was German sitting place, nobody wanted to sit near. And if a German took a bus, no, or even a Quisling, you know what you call them, a Nazi, nobody wanted to come near them. And they would have Germans march in troops, you know, like companies. And when they were marching down the street, we would either turn our back to them and just stand with our back, or we would try to, you know, go on the side streets, so we had nothing to do with it. And if a German, in high school, I was taking English, German, and French. But if a German soldier or anybody came to me and wanted to ask me questions, I acted as if I never knew him. I just didn't speak German because I didn't want to. And we started our resistance groups, you know, and organized. But again, the purpose of the resistance group wasn't really to beat the Germans militarily, because we knew we had no chance. But we wanted to keep the population going. And then there were other things that we would do, which would be part of the resistance group. And we trained, you know, without the Germans seeing it or knowing about it. We would be training so that when the Allied eventually came, we figured we were going to be able to do something to help them fight the Germans. Because we actually knew where they had their camps, and they had built a lot of places where they had dug sort of trenches. So if they had a road that they thought was important, they had these trenches here and there. And of course we made sure that we would know where so that if, you know, the Allied came, we could make sure that they didn't run up against trenches, because then the Germans could suddenly, you know, shoot at them. And there were a lot of things. We were busy with a lot of things. And then when, after 4 years, actually when I finished high school, I was taken, you know, I didn't want to go, but I was put in a labor camp. But that was, you might say, the Quislings and the Germans together. Were all of us, and when we, I guess, finished school over 18, put in labor camps. And they tried to sort of convince us that we should join the Nazis, but it never worked. We did not want to have anything to do with it. And then after 4 years, there were two things that happened. The Germans were getting short of, you know, they were fighting in Russia, and they were short of soldiers, and they were wondering if they could maybe take us and force us to fight the Russians. But we didn't want that, you know. So we went out to the woods and lived in the woods. But at the same time, the Allied wanted to make the Germans believe that they were going to invade Norway. They were actually planning to invade Normandy, but they wanted to draw as many German soldiers as they could up to Norway, and they really succeeded. But part of the bluff was that we were told to go out in the woods so that when they did arrive, the Allied, we would be able to help them. So we lived out in the woods, and it was in the spring, very early spring of 1944 that we went out to the woods. And the war ended on May 8th, 1945. And when we first went to the woods, I can remember sleeping under trees, and there would be snow. And what do you do? The whole group, because like in my case, I would bring all the ones who would be my soldiers, you might say, during those years from the very beginning of the war. So we would be together, and we would sleep very close to each other, because you'd be warmer if you had one person on each side. And the coldest spot was when you were the last one. But then we got tar paper, and we started making, you know, little lean-tos or little huts from tar paper. And that was much better than staying in camps. That there were camps out in the woods in some places, but we preferred the tar paper, because if you stayed in the camp and the Germans surprised you, then you couldn't get out, because if they controlled the door and the windows, how were you going to escape? Like I had a couple of fellows from my group once when the Germans surprised them, and actually we had a lot of people from our camp. They were going to pick up food, because the way we got food was that people in town, we had our organization, what we called the Midlorg, was a military organization. We had older people in town who would then get us food, and they would bring the food out in bags and stuff, and in trucks at, small roads, and they would dump it behind bushes, and we would then be waiting for it, so we would take it and carry it to our camp. And at one point, and that was sort of lucky, a lot of our people were down waiting for a supply of food when the Germans showed up instead and was chasing them all around. And talking about being lucky, the truck with the food, for some reason, had slid and ended up in the ditch. So they never got up there, and they never got involved with the Germans. But there was some of my people who had been on guard duty, because we were on guard duty at certain spots, make sure that the Germans wouldn't surprise us. And they looked out on one side of that little camp they had stayed in, and there they saw all these people who had been waiting for food running, and right behind them was a group of Germans. So they wanted to get away too. And the first fellow who was trying to climb out the window, he got stuck in the window. And the second one, I had to wait for him to get out. So finally the first one got out, and the second one got out. But then the Germans were coming in the door on the other side of the camp. And while they were running away, the Germans were in the window shooting at them, but they missed. And, well, there was snow on the ground, and we were worried that they could follow the tracks. Because that's the problem in the winter. Wherever you go, you leave anybody who wants to follow you can just follow your tracks. So we decided to leave the camp, and actually it was, you might say it was my idea, that we would go to a place where the road was used more, so our steps could get lost, with all the other steps and contracts. So that day, I don't know, the Germans were coming in the morning, so all day I went to the compass and I had a map, and I told everybody we're going to go this far, this north, then we're going to turn and we're going to get down to this town, and then we will get to a road that is full of tracks so we can get lost. And we did, and we made it, all right. But it was very difficult in the winter. So we ended up being sent to Sweden. And that was another trip. We had to take the train from this Porsgrunn to another city that was right by the coast. And we were told to spread around so that nobody would know that, because we went in several groups, and my group was probably like 10 people, And And they said spread around, so nobody sort of realized that it's something going on. And and the conductors and all those people, they were all good Norwegians, you know. So and one came and said, I've heard that the Gestapo, and you know, the Germans had sort of, Gestapo was the police, and they were really cruel. And then it was the SS troops, and they were the ones that were used in special situations, you know, and they were pretty cruel too. And then there were the regular German army. But anyway, the Gestapo never showed up. And then we were told when we got to that city by the coast to wait until everybody else had left the station. Then you go and you spread out in the city so nobody can see that there's something going on here. And we will tell you when it's time to go down to the boat, you know, because they said there's going to be a man with a newspaper, and when he comes around, you know, he will tell you. But the funny thing is, a lot of my fellows, they saw a line, because there was always lines of people standing in line to buy. If they knew that this store had some meat or something, they would, you know, rush there to stand in line and get some food, because food was very scarce. And one of them said there were two women standing in line, and this fellow standing behind him. Heard one woman say to the other, have you noticed all these nice young fellows? In time today. But then finally, the fellow with the newspaper came and told us, go down to the dock, there's a fishing boat, go on board in that fishing boat and go down in the, you know, inside you know, where they carry their fish or whatever. But just go one or two at a time. So for a while there, we would sort of circle around, and then we would see the time we would walk down and act like we were part of the workers, you know. We would go on, we'd sort of do something to something there, looking like we were part of the crew, and then we would hide. And the thing is, there was a big German, you know, Navy ship lying there. So there were a lot of Germans coming down to the dock and signaling to the German warship that they wanted to get on board. They must have been part of the crew. But we made it, and then they took us out to a camp out on an island, and we stayed there for several days. And then eventually came two just small motorboats. And they came and they said, are you the people who are going to Sweden? And we said, yes. So they came just before it turned dark. So we got on board those two motorboats. And then as we started out, it really got dark. So in the darkness, we went across to Sweden. And then, of course, the morning came, and then a boat came, but they were Swedes. And we, you know, told them we were going to Sweden, and they just told us go without that. But then we ended up, we were told we were going to go to a sabotage camp that would be up near the Norwegian border. And that's where we were sent. And well, we actually stayed for maybe 1 or a few weeks at a camp where any Norwegian young man who came, he would be put in a certain camp, and he would be trained. They say we train him as police because the Swedes were neutral. So we sort of they try to make it look like that they're going to train these people after the war. Then they would come. But when we had been there for a while, I thought that, gee, did they forget us, you know? So I called the Norwegian embassy in Stockholm and talked to somebody I had known in the underground. And I said, what's going on? Did you forget us? And they said, oh no, we're going to take you up to another place. So they arranged for us to be moved up to a place much closer to the Norwegian border, actually, in Sweden, because the Swedes, and we weren't too crazy about that, but they tried to do things that so the Germans wouldn't get mad at them. So when it comes to us, we had to be very secret about going to a sabotage camp, you know, and learn, because we were learning, you know, how to handle explosives and traps. And I would say this, that the Germans could put traps out in the woods, and they wouldn't worry about any Norwegian, you know, anybody, a farmer or anything, going there and get into trouble because of those traps. But we, of course, didn't want to put traps out because we didn't want our own people to go. So what we studied more than anything was how to take care of the traps that the Germans may have put up. And that's quite a job. But anyway, and I thought this sort of funny, when he was a captain, I think, who was in charge of this police camp, heard that we were being moved. And I think he heard that I was the one who arranged it. He had me come to his office, and he was yelling at me. I was standing there, not saying anything. And he was saying, don't you know that you don't bypass your officers? If you have any complaint or anything, you go to the officer above you. You don't bypass him and go to your, and you did the wrong thing, and you should know better. And now he said, you're taking my best people, you're taking them away from me. And he was so mad. So finally I said, well, they're not your people. They are my people. They have been with me for well over 4 years. So they're not your people, they're mine. And we ended up in a camp way up in Sweden, up towards the Norwegian border. And we were actually there when the war ended, because the Germans finally surrendered. And then, of course, as soon as they surrendered, we went to Oslo. We were, the same day we actually then we took a train and went right to Oslo. And I think what happened was that a group of probably British and American soldiers, officers I would say, came to Oslo, signed the surrender agreement, and then went back to England. So when we came to Oslo, we were the ones who took over. And I think, well, we were in Oslo for a week or two, right after the surrender, and I think they want to make sure that Oslo had enough people, soldiers, you might say, to keep, for one thing, keep the communists from not trying to take over Norway. And of course, to keep a track of the Germans too. And I think you can, well, but my people, we guarded the king's palace for a few days. But now, when you go to Norway, the king's guard is it's sort of dressed with fancy uniforms and march back and forth. No, we didn't do that. We just made sure that nothing suspicious happened, And then we were doing that just for a few days. And then we went back to Porsgrunn, our town, and they talk about those questions, that it was so nice.
You must have been so happy.
Yeah, it was so nice to come back. Because it was obvious that they appreciated it. And they treated you very nicely. And one thing was the Germans had brought some Russian soldiers that they had taken prisoner and used them for labor, like slave labor. And when we took over, we let them go wherever they wanted. So they would come. This camp where they stayed was not in town, but they would walk out to, there was one restaurant that was popular, and they would go there, and we had no problem with the Russians. And the one thing that I thought was sort of, funny, they must have been trained in the Russian army to be very polite, and they would, and we, in our underground, what we call Miller, we didn't use even the military names for sergeant and so on, lieutenant. We were just, you're leader of this, and you're in charge of that, and the rest of us, we were all friends, and there was nothing different from an officer and the regular member. But the Russians, they would salute. And I can remember when I was downtown with my friends, and these Russians, you would see them come by. I would say, here they come. Because you really could not be sort of rude. So when I come close, I would turn around. So I was sort of facing, not them, but I would face them as I walked by. And all these Russians would salute. And that was the only time that I would ever salute anyone. because what we would do is say hi, and that was it.
So it was a lot different than
Yeah,
the Allies armies.
yeah, and now, you know, you watch TV every so often, you see these sergeants yelling right into the face of something.
Mm-hmm.
To me,
Not in Norway.
I don't understand that.
no, it never happened. We would be laughing, you know. Somebody told. Well, anyway, now, is there anything you want to do? Because what I could do is to read this paper and try to translate them. Because this thing you can read, and this thing will tell you a lot, you know, in the show. And this thing would be about my father. And I don't know if you want to be bothered with that, but that is sort of a, you know, sort of an interesting story too. But I could try to read this and do my best. It's written in Norwegian here, but I will try to translate it as I read. Unless you know somebody else who could translate it for you and type a translation. I don't know.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
That would be awesome.
That picture, that postcard is of the end of the war in 1945 in Oslo.
Oh, yeah.
That one.
I don't think, let me see. Yeah, I don't know if I was in that one, but I know I was in the, yeah, that was one thing. I remember seeing, they must have been British soldiers, but it was a band, and they were dressed like the Scotch, you know, with skirts, and blowing the
Bagpipes.
bagpipe, and there was bagpipes and drums. And when I watched them, they came actually to a little spot where they stopped and played for a while. But the first time I ever saw these people with skirts, wow, look at them. Men not only wearing skirts, but short skirts. And then, what was with the people who were drumming, they would throw these sticks up and they would spin and they would grab them again. And I was thinking, well, they probably spent 5 years in the war doing nothing but practicing. So now they are very good at it. Because, you know, it really was impressive the way they threw them and they were spinning, come down. And to me that was wow. Yeah, and another thing was in Oslo, they set up, oh, what would you call it? It wasn't a bar, it was oh, what's the name for that one? You have a room where you can eat and you know. There are many places where they have a bar and then they have
Sports bars here.
A restaurant?
It was,
Dining room?
no, it was, there's another word for my memory isn't that good. But anyway, they had one that was for officers only.
A club of some kind?
Yeah. And we said, gee, like I said, I'm an officer, but if I can't go there with my people, I wouldn't ever want to get in there at all. So they made an exception that for the British and American armies and so on. It was an officer's place. But we could go. Anybody. And we did go to a few times, but we didn't stay around that long. But the first few months after the war ended was really a nice period, because people were so nice to you. And now another thing I think is that those papers, they talk about if you're ever worried or scared. I would say that I was never scared, because you know what you have to do, and you're prepared to do it. And being scared and worrying about it doesn't do you any good, because you can't help it. You're going to do something, you're going to do it. So I can say that I was never scared. But there was one thing that did worry me, and that was if I gave an order and goofed it, and then somebody might get killed. And that would be bad enough, but at least he would be out of trouble. But to go back to town and have to meet his relatives, you know, it could be parents, it could be family, wife, and then admit that he died because I goofed it. That scared me.
Okay, now you can read your papers.
But then, whenever I could, I tried to do what had to be done if it was very dangerous. And otherwise, I would try to switch it so that each person who may have been a scout or something, you would maybe every half hour I would switch it so that it wouldn't be one person who had, you know, a long time of being exposed to danger, you might say. Anyway, you want me to read this to you? I have two of them, and this tells you maybe more than I have told you, because I had to hear from this is, well, you can, I'll try. When the war started, April 9th, 1940, I was going to the high school in Thorbjorn, junior class. Then the school ended for a while. I believe we started the school again sometime in May. In the time outside, come a friend of mine and said, why don't you start a group so we can be ready to help the British when they come back. That I thought was a good idea, so I asked 9 of my friends, most of them were also in my class, if they would participate in this. Everybody said yes. This group then come to my home in Thorbjorn quite often, and this continued all the way and all the time until we left for the woods 4 years later. Some of them moved from Thorbjorn during these years, but basically we kept together very well under the whole war. And actually we brought in a few, like brothers of the first ones who were maybe a year or two younger. So we kept the same size all the time. When we were 10. The first we did was to agree that we had to have our backpacks ready for a quick
Get away.
activity. So we set up a list of what we had to have in the backpack. Also sleeping bag and food for several days. During the winter, we also had to have with us, well, we called it disappearing clothes, but there was actually a jacket and pants and so on that were all white. And my mother sewed quite a few of them. Everything she needed was only an old sheet. In other words, if they could from home come up with a bed sheet, then she would sew, and she was very good at sewing things. We had been Boy Scouts, so just before the war, we had participated in the Army's voluntary military exercise. And I have to explain that the Army, just before the Germans came, and it had nothing, the Army didn't even know about the Germans coming, you know, but they had a training course, and all my friends, of course, we always all joined, and the officers in the local army would take us out and teach us, you know, different things. The father of one of our group's members had quite a few of the Norwegian Army's different instruction booklets, and these he gave to me, because every meeting I studied these papers and then discussed what I had learned with the group. Often we also went on trips together on Sundays and did training at places out in the woods. One thing that scared me was the thought of coming up against the German with a bayonet. To solve that problem, I asked one of my gym teachers, and he had been, if he would teach us bayonet fencing. He had been a lieutenant before the war and had been in the fights in northern Norway. He said yes to this. One of the group's members had a good place for us. His farm had a wood factory, and there it was where we practiced the training with long poles at least once a week. Our gym teacher was always there to instruct us, and we became very good fighting with a bayonet. During the Easter vacation in 1941, he was also with us up in the mountains, where he was our instructor. One day in 1940 came a man and asked me if I would become a member of a resistance organization which was going to be started in Thorsen. I asked yes and said then I will come in with a whole group. But not long afterwards, he came to me again and said that I would have to forget it because one of the leaders of the organization was no longer completely reliable. In other words, he started to get sort of Nazi ideas, but that happened sometimes. After a while, I was again asked to join a resistance organization, and as before, I asked that then I will come in with a whole group. This time it went well. It was Milog. That's the abbreviation of military organization. That then was started in Porsgrunn. After a while, I became the next in command in our troop. Well, what happened was that the Norwegian army has 10 groups, and then there is one man who is in charge of those 10, and that is, I probably have something similar in the American army. But after a while I became the second in command in our troop. The leader was somewhat elder than me and had been an officer in the Norwegian army before the war. There was 4 groups in this troop, and once in a while the leader and I met with the group's leaders. Towards the end of war, 1943-44, the whole troop also had practices out in the woods. In 1944, we had to escape to the woods. Our group still kept together very well, and in the fall we were in a Milorg camp where we were fully well, we had machine pistols. They were called Sten gun, and they were made in England. When the snub came, the Germans found us, and we had to escape to Sweden, where we were on a sabotage camp in Dalarna at Elberg. That's a mountain in Sweden. There we were when the war ended. We were at once sent to Oslo, where we was in a short period until we were sent back to Porsgrunn. While we were in Oslo, we guarded the King's Castle for a few days. That's all right?
Mm-hmm. Now, it was obvious that during the war you had your resistance group against the Germans, and you weren't too fond of them.
No.
How do you feel about Germans today?
Well, I would say that I never had anything against German women, you know, because, well, they weren't active anyway. And as far as the Germans today, those who participated in World War II, they are now very old. And it seems that the younger Germans, they are just like anybody else. So I would say I have nothing against the ordinary German people. Now, I never liked, especially if I knew a German had been in the army, but that I would feel a little bit it's difficult to sort of accept them. But there again, there were probably a lot of Germans who, you know what they always say, I did my duty. I was told, yeah, I have no choice. And I don't know whether that is a good excuse or not, but it's very common. But I would say that, I was telling you, that was the Gestapo, their SS, and they were very cruel. They had, if they caught some of our people, the first thing they would do, and why we were so secret with each other, like I would, like when I was second in command, I knew the leaders of each of those 4 groups, but I had no idea who were in, you know, involved. And the same thing, the fellow who was in charge of, who was above me, he may have known the next one up. I didn't know him at all. But the Gestapo, if they caught somebody and they think that somebody knew something they wanted to know, they would be very cruel. They would pull your nails. And they had what they call a thumb screw. There was a little thing they put around your thumb, and it had a screw that you could tighten down until it crushed your bone. And then they had another one that they would put right here on your leg, the same thing, with a screw that you tighten up until they crushed your leg bone. And I know they exist because I saw them after World War II, after the war. And you know, it's something, you never know how a person is going to stand up to that kind of treatment. Some would start talking as soon as they started hurting. And some they would practically kill them, and they would never talk. But it was very difficult to look at one person and know exactly how he's going to react. And he was a friend of one of my sisters, and he just lost his mind, you know, he became crazy. They were telling me that because he was getting so completely crazy, they had put him in the hospital somewhere. But there were 2 in the hospital. And they said that he crawled under the hospital bed of the other person. And and I think he was shot eventually. And I remember that there were some policemen that refused to do something that Germans told them to do. And when they refused, the Germans just shot them. And when we did not have, I got a uniform towards the end of the war, actually when I was in Sweden. Before that, we were all dressed, you know, regular clothes. And the Germans, if they caught somebody without a uniform, they would shoot them. And I don't know if I told you that Sten guns, I think what we usually got was the junky stuff that the other, like the British and the US made good guns. The British made these, what they call stain guns, and they made them in any kind of, even a car repair place, they had them put them together. And they were not very good. And they were very dangerous because you could just knock it or drop it and it would start going off. And I know I had one of my people come to me one day and he said, you know, so-and-so almost shot me. And he had bumped the gun and bullets had started. But I would say this too, that we were talking about the Norwegian Army had that training camp, or not camp, we were just being asked if we wanted to volunteer to be trained, and all my friends did so. And that was just maybe a week or before the Germans arrived. And we went to an army camp that was quite far away, but there were a lot of people there, I think several hundred. And we had, a rifle competition. And actually it was, you would shoot the rifle and you would shoot submachine gun. And I won the meet. I was number 1 with a rifle and number 2 with a submachine gun. And that would add up to 3. You're number 1, you're number 2. Now, the one who was number 1 with a submachine gun, he may not have been very good with a rifle. So let's say if he got number 7, number 8, or something like that with a rifle, then it would be 1 and 7. So while my number was 3, his would be 7 or 8 or whatever. So that's the way that I was the only one with number 3. Now here's another. Are you still willing to listen?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Now this is to the committee that was organizing the celebration of the end of the war. And well, I'll just read it to you. And this I'm sending to that committee. See?
Mm-hmm.
I have just received a newspaper clipping from my sister in Pushkin regarding the celebration of the 50-year well, what 50-year
Celebration of
celebration
the
of
Anniversary.
the liberation, the 8th of May, 1995. Unfortunately, my letter comes a little after the 15th of January, 1995, because they said if you want to participate, you have to have your papers, request or application in before this time. But I hope still that I will get the opportunity to participate in the arrangements. And they had a certain number of things you could participate in. So I said number 2, 3, and 4. I live now in Indian Lake in the state of New York. I have for many years planned to go to Norway in 1995 to participate in the activities which I assume would be arranged to celebrate or to remember the end of the war in May 1945. My wife and I have actually already arranged a trip and bought tickets. We will arrive in Norway at the end of March, so and think and count on be there for 2-3 months. I'm still a Norwegian citizen. This is my history. I was born in Kragerø the 11th of October 1921. My mother came from a small farm outside of Kragerø. My father was from Kragerø. The day he filled 14 years old, he went to sea, and he became a captain when he was 26 years old. When I was 9 years old, we moved to Pushkin, and when the invasion came, I was 18 years old and went to high school in Pushkin. In the morning, the 9th of April, I went to school as usual, but was told that the school will be closed for the time being. I then went to the police department, the police office, because I was told that they need help. I was accepted as police right away and was sent out to patrol a piece of Main Street. The day after came the officer who had the responsibility for our district in his car and asked me to join the military as voluntary. He said, I have an opening in my line and I'm sending out the patrol tonight. I would like you to go with him. Bring food for 3 days. I said yes, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I was picked up and taken out to the coast with the rest of the patrol. Unfortunately, the defense collapsed at our area very quickly, so my time as a Norwegian soldier in 1940 was very short. After a while, we started going to school again, and I and my friends continued our resistance to the Germans. Then, when they started building defense arrangement at the coast, sent the one Captain Arthur Hauge, that was me and 2 of my friends, out to spy on the German defense setup between Langs and Agder. That's 2 cities out by the coast. Thereby, it was a difficult job with much pig tool. What is the, you know, when you have a wire with a lot of
Barbed wire?
barbed wire, and it was a difficult job with much barbed wire and many German observation posts. And I said, Hauge, that's the one who sent me out there. He was then my neighbor and gymnastic teacher. At one time, one time, or for a while, I was also active with the secret newspapers. And, newspapers. These were printed in Skien. That was a city next to Pushkin. A friend of mine biked in the evening to Skien and picked up the newspapers. Then he came to me around midnight and knocked on my bedroom window. We sat in the kitchen and spread out the papers in groups, which we then gave to other people the next day. In other words, we just had so many groups of papers, and each group we gave to somebody who then passed it on to other people again, to spread out the newspapers was a risky job. It didn't last long before many people knew that it was you who did it, and one could never be sure that the Germans or the Nazis eventually would find out about it. After a while, the newspapers stopped coming, but a few months later, they started again. This went well for quite a long time, but finally it stopped for the second and last time. I have always had much respect for those who got the news on the radio from London and then printed the papers. They must, of course, have known that such an activity could not continue very long before they were discovered and arrested. My most important activity during the war was as member of Milorg. When the school started again later on in the spring of 1940, I organized a group of my school friends of 10 men, 10 of them. The idea was to be prepared to help the British when they came back.
I think so.
Something we thought would happen not too pretty soon.
There should still be some.
That was
I'm sorry, I was just checking to make sure there was more tape. Yeah, it's only an hour. There should still be more. It should be fine. Okay. Sorry.
okay.
Yep.
That was quite naive. So if after a while we realized that it could go many years before the war ended. The first attempt to start a resistance group in Portugal was not pretty good. One of my neighbors asked me one day in 1940 if I would become a member of this organization. I answered yes and said that I would come in not alone but with a complete group. And a while later I met my neighbor again and asked him how things were going, and he said that I should not anymore talk about that because one of the leaders of the organization no longer was quite reliable. We continued anyway with our group on our own. About a year later, I was again asked if I would be a member of Milorg, and this time it was an organization that lasted for the rest of the war. Again, I answered that I will come in with a complete group. This group kept together during the whole war. We went to the woods together, we went to Sweden together, and we celebrated the war together. When Crown Prince Ola came back to Oslo, but before the King Haakon came back, we were even guards around the castle for a few days. In Portugal, I was the second in command in our troop in Milorg for some years, and in Sweden I became the troop leader for our troop at the sabotage camp at Elberg in Dalarna, and that's in Sweden. But unfortunately, when the appointment came, I was lying in the sick barrack with high fever. I had problems with my stomach, and that put an end to my military career. I had actually thought to continue in the military after the war, but with a stomach that was not quite in good form, I had to give that up. My civilian life after the war had its good and bad sides. After school, after finishing school, I was I got a job at the office at Eidanger Salpeterfabrikken, Norsk Hydro. That's what the company was called. And everything went fine until the factory was bombed. The planes came over the factory area four times and dropped a big number of bombs each time. The first time, a big bomb exploded just a few meters from me. One friend who sat next to me was killed by the explosion. Two others were covered by stone and a piece of wood. The one had the legs
Sticking out.
fast means it's when you can't move it, what is it?
Paralyzed or?
He had his legs
He was covered with
covered
debris,
with
so he couldn't
big
move his
stones, and the body was covered by pieces of wood and some big wood pieces. I helped him to get loose. When I was working on that, I heard a voice who said, "Oh, you're stepping on me." I discovered then two legs that stuck out from the pile of stones. I dug him loose also, but before I was finished came the bombs again. Two big stones came sailing in the air towards me, but each time I saw them early enough to be able to throw myself to the side. A piece of a bomb hit the ground where I had been sitting just before. A bomb exploded somewhat away from me and threw a lot of dirt, stone, and garbage up in the air in front of me. I saw it coming towards me and had just enough time to run under a tree and stand up against the tree. I was, of course, very lucky that time. 50, 60 people were killed under that bomb attack. My father's boat was not in Norway when the invasion came, and we had hoped that he would be safely over in America while the war lasted. But it didn't happen. That didn't happen, unfortunately. His boat was torpedoed outside of Long Island in 1942, and of the whole crew, only 6 were saved. My father was one of them who lost his life. My mother died while I was at Elberg in Sweden. When the war ended, I had to give up my career in the military, and I decided to study. But first I wanted to learn English. A friend of my father, a shipbroker in London, promised me a job there, but I could not start until February 1946. I decided, therefore, to take a trip to the USA in the meantime, and came to Baltimore with a freighter late in the fall of 1945. The Seamen's pastor in Baltimore meant that I ought to study in the U.S. And he talked into visiting the Norwegian embassy in Washington, D.C., where I met Hans Ola. Ola was his was his main name. In other words, his what do you call that? No, your name is Thorsen. What is that? You're not named.
That's my married name. My maiden name?
Well, no. Well, anyway, Hans is his first name, and Ola is his second name.
His middle name?
No, not middle. It's the last name. What?
Surname?
What is your name?
Jennifer Hudson.
What's the last one?
Hudson.
Well, what is that called?
Last name.
Last name.
Last name. All right. Ola was his last name. Hans Ola sent me to the Institute of International Education in New York, and they arranged it that I could go to Dartmouth College with full, well, stipend. In other words, I had full, yeah, in other words, I got the, now what do you call that again? When, if you go to college, what are you going to pay the college?
Tuition.
Tuition, yeah, with full tuition. So I gave up the trip to London and went to Dartmouth instead. After 14 months in school, I got a master's degree of business administration from Dartmouth College. I had always had plans to go back to Norway, but that was postponed continuously, and I'm still in the U.S. I live now in Indian Lake, New York, and then I say that's another long history. I'm sending with this letter different attachment which describe in bigger detail some of the things that I have written about in this letter. This got to be a bigger story than I had counted on, but it was difficult to start when you're first getting started and all the old recollections come forth in your thought. Usually this is something that you don't often think about anymore. Well, is that all right? Well, let me see.
I don't want to interrupt or anything, but how did you two meet?
Pardon?
How did you two meet?
Well, we were neighbors. And I have to say that I got married down in Armonk, New York. And, well, no, I wasn't married. I was actually living in Manhattan. And I happened to meet this woman, and I was all by myself. And I'm not sure whether I should tell you the problems, but she had certain problems. And we couldn't really get along together. But I was not going to give up my children. So I stayed with her for maybe 20 years.
They had
Because
4
we
children.
agreed that we were going to get divorced when the youngest kid finished high school. And actually, when that time came, I said, okay, now we should get divorced. And then she didn't want to, like some of her friends said, that she wanted the advantages of married life without having a husband. And another one of her friends said to me, but didn't you know? And she said the handwriting was on the wall from the very beginning because of her family problems and all that. But anyway, so I arranged to have a lawyer arrange for a divorce. And then my wife wanted
Jury.
a jury. So we had a proceeding in court with a jury. And when the jury left, the woman, sort of young woman who had been recording everything, she said to me, I know what the answer is going to be. And I said to her, well, tell me. And she said, no, you'll find out. And the jury was in for maybe 5 minutes and came in and gave me a divorce. But we had been going up here skiing. We used to go to Gore. And we had this house we're telling you was that Nancy and I ended up building a 3-story house. But when we first started, we just put up the foundation. And then we put a
flat
roof on it. And what happened was that we would go up and go skiing. And the way we got started with skiing was that my oldest son had a friend and his family took him skiing. And I guess they went to Gore a lot. So he was the one who talked us into going skiing at Gore. And I think I had a son, a daughter, and daughter's son. And of course my oldest son, when he went to college in Seattle. Because one thing he liked was all the ski areas about an hour east of Seattle. So he got a bachelor's degree of
Business?
Economics. And as soon as he finished school, he went right to Sun Valley, where he spent his time in the winter as a ski instructor. And Sun Valley was the place where all these fancy people were going. Like the CNN, what's his name, who owns CNN? Well, he would be there. And what's the woman who was?
She was a star in Gone with the Wind.
Yeah. The one who was the star.
Vivian Lee.
Yeah.
But get back to the story, the question that she asked.
Well, anyway, when my son got married, Vivian Lee came to his wedding. But anyway, I ended up with just my youngest boy, you know, and he and I would go skiing a lot. And he became, well, you're not from New York, but he became the New York Public High School Alpine champion. And I should show you, I will show you some pictures of that. But anyway, we would come up, and sometimes she was my neighbor over where actually Rolf and I would come. We would come up Friday night, you know, after school, Friday, we would drive up to the place, and we would just shovel enough snow to get the car parked, and then we would stay up there. But sometimes when he was, I took him to Lake Placid, where he spent a week. It may have been in the winter sometime, and sort of getting a course in, you know, downhill skiing, you know, slalom, giant slalom and all that. And then sometimes I would go over and visit her. She was a neighbor. And before...
And I was a widow.
Yes. And what happened when I saw her, I felt sorry for her because she actually had two husbands and they both died. But then, one day, I came over just to visit her because I had nothing else to do.
And I had 4 children.
And I would be, I think we sat in the kitchen and I had a cup of tea or something. And she was telling me that she had a friend or neighbor or whatever who had gotten married again after her husband died. And I said to her, I would never ever get married again. That's the biggest mistake I ever done. And I'm never going to do it again.
Never say never.
But then she said, oh yeah, I think I wouldn't mind getting married at all. And then, from before, I had always looked at her, at the poor woman, the poor mother, and I wasn't thinking about her in any other way. But then when she said she wouldn't mind getting married, I suddenly looked at her and I said, gee, she's a nice woman.
So anyway,
That's the way it started.
we didn't, this was before he had his divorce though, and I had nothing to do with
the
his
tape
divorce.
just ended.
It ended.